Hey there, and thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast. This is episode 100. For episode 100, I had a lot of thoughts, a lot of potential ideas, but in the end, I decided the best way for the Hour of History to celebrate this milestone was by me just simply talking to you, offering you a word of thanks, saying a word about the guests, talking about the producer, giving you a little information about myself, and then talking about the future of the Hour of History podcast. I think in that way, you can enjoy a short recap of the show, some suggestions for episodes to go back and listen to, and rather than having clips from episodes, you can go back and enjoy them in their entirety, as Hour of History podcast episodes were meant to be enjoyed. So, thanks for listening. This is going to be a brief overview of what has been an awesome journey of 100 episodes. I'm so looking forward to the next 100 episodes on Hour of History, where it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast.
Our world.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
First, I wanted to thank the audience. A word of thanks to our listeners, readers, subscribers. Whether you listen on the Hour of History podcast when you see a topic that interests you, or you're one of the many people who listens every single week, thanks for participating in the podcast. Seeing your comments, seeing your critiques, some of the retweets, the likes, those are the fuel that keeps me going and doing the long process that you can read about at the Hour of History blog. There's a lot of you out there. Just by way of stats, the Hour of History website has had tens of thousands of visitors in the last 2 years, with an audience that gets larger and larger every day. It's been truly extraordinary for me to sit and watch as something just grew from a small conversation to what is really part of a global experience of history, topics that range from the early modern, the ancient, all the way to the present day politics. As you might expect in an English language podcast that's produced in the United States of America, the biggest audience comes from the United States of America, with people listening from all 50 states, territories, and so on in the US. We also have a sizable following in India, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Spain, Ireland, and China. Basically, anywhere in the world where people are trying to access history through the English language, people are tuning in to the Hour of History. So whether you're in, say, Florida, listening to one of our podcasts on minor league baseball, or you're in China and you're trying to figure out what's happening in Taiwan, you could be in India and listening to some history about the Swadeshi movement, or maybe you're in the United Kingdom and you want to learn about ancient Rome. What's great about the Hour of History is it's not just for people in one particular geographic location. And it's great to see how the audience has grown all over the world. While most of our audience comes from the English-speaking world, we have visitors from over 112 different countries that listen to some of the greatest podcasts, the greatest academics podcasting about their new works. 112 countries, it's not 200, it's not the full United Nations yet, but we're only on episode 100, so I look forward into filling in the rest of that map. We have visitors that come from each continent and really show that history is not geographically limited. No matter if you're in South America, Russia, Australia, there's a topic for you and a topic that might make your commute a little easier, or just make a conversation that you want to listen to more accessible, give you an idea of a new book or a topic in history. I love seeing the comments that people leave. Sometimes people leave the comment on a blog on a weekly basis. A shout out to Danny, who leaves a comment after listening to the podcast. People often ask how they can support the podcast. One of the simple things you can do is offer a like or a retweet. Nothing makes me happier than seeing someone who has mentioned that the podcast was something they enjoyed listening to, sending me a text message and saying, or an email and saying, I thought this episode was really good. When I see a like that says, it was very interesting to finally hear about ancient Rome. Or maybe a comment on Facebook that says, thank you for doing history of baseball and the history of sports. It's great to see these shout outs, and it gives me an idea of what sort of guests you'd like to have on in the future. So this first part of episode 100 is a thank you to you, the audience. I like to imagine you sitting and listening and trying to understand some of the greatest scholars in the world that you may not have known before. You might never have heard of Sandy Olguin until you logged into Hour of History podcast, and then you see the brilliant work she's doing on Spanish identity and flamenco and music. You may not know of the Irish traditional music scene until you see Patrick McGeegan's episode or Sarah Goch's conversation about how Irish music has spread all over the world. It may have given you in, say, India the confidence to go check out an Irish pub next time you're in a major metropolitan area. And that's what makes the Hour of History podcast really worth producing and really worth enjoying. So I thank you, audience. Of course, the audience is the central movement of the podcast. It's the reason I produce it. As long as there's one person listening on, it doesn't need to be tens of thousands of people. I mean, I enjoy it that way, but as long as it's making a difference for at least someone, maybe someone who's studying for comps and needs some background for a book, or maybe someone who just didn't learn about the Civil War in high school history in the United States and wants a more detailed understanding. As long as there's one person who's interested, I'll continue producing the Hour of History podcast. And I thank you for your feedback. You can always go to hourofhistory.com/contact and send us some information, suggestions, things you liked, things you didn't like, things you want to hear next time. I'm always listening. Of course, without the guests, we wouldn't have a podcast. It's the guests who really bring history to our devices every single week. Hours of research in archives all over the world, countless moments of writing, editing, presenting, and contemplating what might someday become a finished book to share with the world. Recently, we had David Bryden presenting a book that he shared with the world for free thanks to the Wellcome Trust, a book that you can go online with links from the Hour of History podcast and get a full PDF. Historians work sometimes for decades producing books. They research each sentence. They make sure every source is accurate and correct. And those guests share that information with you for free on the Hour of History podcast. And to me, that's something extraordinary. In 100 episodes, we've had over 62 guests who've brought materials from continents all over the world to share on a podcast. You might think an example like the global history of hockey is limited to a continent like North America, where it's biggest in Canada. But we saw that it started in England and it became a global sort of picture that, we now have leagues in China and Europe. Though many projects are focused on one country, such as our project we talked about with Maria Hammock, it's focused on Mexico, but ultimately it's about people crossing borders, enslaved people in the American South going across this border, similar to Carrie Gibson's idea in El Norte, how we talk often about the United States history starting from the Atlantic coast, but she traces a larger history with Hispanic North America. These historians have taken sources that are not limited to one continent, one country, one nation. They go to archives all over the world to produce their work, and then they sit and talk about it and share it with you. So I urge you to check out some of those extraordinary podcasts, because I ask every week, how did you get that information? Where did your source come from? How do we know this history is true? And with that, you get a little insight. Now, all of these books, often episodes are paired with book release, are thoroughly vetted in what's called a peer review process. Books published by Oxford University Press, Nebraska University Press, the University of Florida Press, many other university presses have featured on the Hour of History podcast. These are presses that hold historians to the highest level, make sure claims are just not spurious and thrown in, but backed up by valid information. That's not to say some of the other books, the more popular presses, those released by Simon & Schuster, Penguin, Random House, Amazon, many other top publishers that have been featured on the Hour of History, aren't thoroughly vetted. No, in fact, those are just as thoroughly vetted, often previously coming from historical documents and archives in the same way, except they're produced in a much more readable fashion where not every sentence has to be packed with information, but rather it's a story that we can all relate to. Whatever the medium or mode of production, publishing, and there have been a lot on the Hour of History podcast, I always make sure that you're hearing from guests who are selected by publishers, who are well respected in the industry, and who bring you the greatest information, the greatest historical information. And I want to do this over not just one time period. There are some great podcasts out there, like the Ottoman History podcast, that focuses on hundreds and thousands of years of one region and perhaps one regime. For me, I decided to look at many time periods. Topics have gone from ancient to modern. You should check out some of these episodes and listen to them in their full entirety so you can really get an understanding of other time periods. I talked with Courtney Conchu about Anglo-Saxons, a topic I knew very little about. I learned about the beauty of the Old English language and how some of these sources are poetry, how the rhyme and sounds of Old English isn't too different from the rhythm and sounds of flamenco that I mentioned before that Sandy Olguin taught us about. Many shows include clips about these sort of things, about how interactions with sources have changed the way historians have viewed civilizations. Typically, a 100th celebration episode might offer a montage, a clip of each of these, but I really think you should go check out the whole episode. Listen to me talk to Jason Colby about how his family was connected to orca capture business and how he had established his career first as a historian before he could look into some of his own family history and some of the issues that were closer to his heart. One of the ideas of this hour-long production is that we can get to some of these deeper questions, is that we can find out what's beyond the pages. It's not simply a book presentation. It's not simply a lecture, but rather it's a conversation. It's sitting in a room with someone for an entire hour. It's not all books and publishers and established historians, but graduate students, historians who are in the process of being developed into these great historians, have also made excellent podcast episodes. In the first early episodes of the Hour of History podcast, I sat down with Matthias Fueling, who brought an enormous breadth of knowledge to the table for conversations on Syria, China, and the Kurds. I talked to Keith Riley about Sandinistas and Andrea Scioto about how he was able to create technology to help him research in the archives. Ali Straub walked the Camino and told me about it and about how nature and the environment affected her historical research. And Travis Roy taught me the ups and downs of teaching and teaching with popular culture, how students of different generations can still empathize with many of these similar themes that we see in popular culture. Some of these graduate students were the founders, were the beginning forces that brought the Hour of History podcast together, and their episodes are still visited by people all over the world. It takes a lot of courage to sit down in front of a microphone and just put yourself up to questions, to nonstop questions that you don't know where they're going to come from. And all of these people have sat with me to share their work with the world, to put their voice out there, and it's created a great friendship, not just with me, but with guests. I talked with Ken Strange about his walk on the Camino de Santiago, and I could see myself there, and I could see other people there someday walking with him on his journey. Having heard him on the Hour of History podcast, someday seeing him in real life, walking with him. I want to walk across the streets of China with Jonathan Chatwin after reading his book on Beijing. And I still follow him on Twitter, and I see pictures and images and walks that he's currently taking, new projects. I'm not sure I would try mescaline, but Mike J had a good sell for it when he told me about sitting with native groups in the United States and looking into these ancient traditions they had. I've been lucky enough to meet some of the guests. I've played tunes with Padraig McGuigan. I've listened to some of the tunes that Sarah Goek described. I've listened to some of these podcasts, like my conversation with Kate Brown, after recording them, after watching a popular representation of what they worked on, and I've learned even more, and for that, I'm enormously grateful. I see these historians' names pop up all over town. They do talks all over the world, on the East Coast of the United States, on the West Coast, in the United Kingdom, in India, in Australia. And I think how lucky I am to have had an hour to share with them, to share with the world. And I hope you go back and check out some of these great episodes. Every week, for 100 episodes, we've produced an episode. The platform that it's released on is in your pocket, in the podcast. We also do a YouTube project. We don't have video for YouTube yet, but it is a hope that someday these interviews will not just be remote, but rather bring live face-to-face conversation, maybe not just limited to an hour, though we have our wonderful title. Every week, the episode is carefully planned out. It starts with an idea, often a suggestion. You can read about the process at the Hour of History blog. A lot of people have been interested in that, how to make a podcast process. It's one of the more popular blog articles because I think a lot of people are interested, and I think everyone who is interested in this sort of project should look into it. We have a new Atomic Age podcast coming out from former Hour of History guest Sarah Roby, who's been working on developing her own podcast. And that's something I think is a wonderful medium that everyone has, that everyone can create. And I look forward to seeing former guests producing their own podcasts. Anyway, we work on creating through this idea, making arrangements with people all over the world in all kinds of time zones. I like to read and prepare their work before I interview them, so I'm not completely lost, even if I'm talking about a topic that I'm not entirely sure about. After recording, I work across the world. I send the episode over to be produced. You can listen to how that happens in the conversation I have with James Abel, where we talk about So You Want to Be a Podcaster. The technical side is one of the more daunting tasks of the podcast. When I talked to Christine Cacciapodi, we talked about how difficult it is, and she created this great project, the Footnoting History Project, how difficult it is to keep deadlines, to keep things running, to keep things edited, and to keep the technology all right. But good podcasts do it, and one of the main goals is to produce every week so we can reach these numbers. And I look forward to the next 100 episodes. I remember starting the first episode about St. Patrick. I recorded it with James. He co-hosted it. He was across the world It was recorded in Vietnam and the United States, the east coast of the United States, in conversation with Southeast Asia about an English priest who went to Ireland. What an extraordinary thing that this technology has brought us the ability to do. When I did just now, episode 99, and I talked about Bengal, it was a recording that was done, a conversation about the early 1900s, about the British Raj in India and how Indians used culture to fight back, with Mimasha Pandit, how Indians used this popular culture, theater. It reminded me of my conversation I had with Travis Roy. This brought in people from Philadelphia, people from Bengal, people from Washington, D.C., and it went out to the world. And that's extraordinary. And that happens with the help of the producer, with the help of the technological side. The Hour of History website is well curated, and you can go get suggestions, and many people do, for books related to topics of the podcast. I do hope you'll check it out. Check out our suggestion site, hourofhistory.com/Rex. And all this technology, I hope, will continue to get greater as we add new projects, add video, and continue to produce the Hour of History podcast. Finally, as host, I don't get to talk about myself often because usually I'm interviewing people. This project has been enormously rewarding for myself, although I don't see it as a project for myself. I see it as something for the audience and for the guests and for history as a discipline. As a PhD student, I didn't feel like I was getting enough creative support in what seems like a medieval system. I knew I had to create something that was different than the traditional way in which historians interact with each other. Typically, we might get a few hours here or there. We might meet for a few minutes with an established historian. We might hear their talk and get to sneak in one question at a conference. If we're so lucky to be relatively well established, we might talk to them for more than one conversation, but it's always going to be about something that you're interested in working with. Very rarely is it going to be a chance for them to talk about their own work. I've sat with many established historians and blabbered on about my own work while they sat silently and listened and tried to help me. Historians are selfless in this way, but at the same time, I could never learn about their work. It was a strange situation where advisors and mentors and people who I respect can never tell me about what they're thinking about, what they're working on. At the same time, conversations and podcasts have been much deeper and more authentic than anything I've experienced in said office hours. Perhaps the small talk at conference where people are trying to quickly get your ideas is for a much more narrow purpose. And the podcast throws all of that out. It gives you a chance to sit down, talk, and listen to someone for at least an hour on something that is necessary and important to our world, something that we should all be talking about. I do it because it gives me an opportunity, this podcast, to hear new voices. Maria Hammock is a good example. She's a young historian who's working at the University of Texas on an enormously interesting process that reverses the way we look at the border and people escaping for freedom in Mexico. Her work isn't out yet, but she offered to chat with the Hour of History podcast and share some of the stories and some of the history that she's looking into. This is a conversation that I might not have been able to have. I wouldn't have been able to have without the podcast. And these new voices, I'm very eager to hear. So these are also some of the most difficult new voices to find. So if you have suggestions of someone who's working on a new project who might not necessarily be published yet, but who you think the world would be interested in hearing, please let me know. The podcast gives me the opportunity to talk about historians outside of the academy. My early episode on with Jeffrey Cobb about the Sugar King in New York, who continues to write great histories, Jeffrey Cobb does, while teaching in New York City schools. It's extraordinary. Many historians are traveling to archives all over the world on a university budget, but Cobb is educating the next generation of historians while also writing these tremendously important local histories. You can see a little bit about myself by the guests who I choose. I'm interested in these local stories. I'm interested in these people who do more than one thing, who are getting deep down to important questions, but not hung up at their current state in life, not looking for status, or not necessarily using the status they have to produce something, but rather some people who are just curious, people who are interested. These stories connect to me because I've always felt a bit of an academic outsider. The academy dictates that you create and behave in a certain way that replicates your advisors and teachers. But everyone can teach us something. I truly believe that. Our advisors and teachers can all be academics if we take time and listen to them and read their work. They need not be in the academy. They could be anywhere. Just because we work at the same institution doesn't mean that advice would be more pertinent than, say, someone who doesn't work in academia. I truly believe we should stay open to advice from everyone, and you might be surprised what you actually end up learning along the way. The Hour of History podcast has given me an opportunity to do that. I don't think I would have been able to study the history of an organization started by my father's uncle, Father John Bauman. He started the PICO network years ago in Oakland, community organizing. I would see him every Christmas at family Christmases, at family reunions, and we would talk. But I would never really get to ask him questions about how he created something, how he did something different. The Hour of History podcast gave me an opportunity to do that. And it taught me something beyond what I would learn in the PhD program. As I'm creating the Hour of History podcast, I'm also working on my PhD. It's like taking 2 full-time jobs. It's an enormous amount of time. Not only do I have to do my own research and writing and teaching, fellowships, things like that, reading, all the things you might expect a historian to do, I also have to learn and be interested in work that's totally outside of my field. It's no easy task, but it's certainly one that's rewarding. People often ask, how can I support the Hour of History podcast? I mentioned earlier how much those retweets and likes and comments actually mean to me. It's interesting to hear people say, I support the Hour of History podcast, and then they choose not to subscribe or listen. I don't know what makes that difference in a person. What makes someone who loves you equally the same take the time to go on their phone and subscribe versus someone who just says, oh, cool, and forgets about it? I believe we can all be a little better, and I like to take interest in your projects as well. So please share. If you're starting a new podcast or if you're starting a new project, let me know, and I'll have you on the Hour of History podcast so you can share it with the world. We don't have a traditional donation account like a Patreon that asks for contributions. I want to keep the Hour of History podcast free and independent. I don't want it to be affiliated with university programs or people who are going to tell me what to do on the podcast. I want the audience, the guests, to tell me what to do, and no money, no strings to be attached to it. In the future, I look forward to having something like a Patreon, something that gives guests, gives audience members a way to give back. I want the Hour of History podcast to last for a long time, and it's working on the PhD is a huge moment of insecurity. It's a time where I don't know where I'm going to be in the future. I don't know what city, what job, what career, what profession. I don't know how long the PhD will take. Enormous amount of uncertainty, which goes against the sort of certainty and steadfast history produced in the Hour of History project. So keep an eye out on the hourofhistory.com. Hopefully soon I'll have ways for you to support the podcast. And that brings me to talking about the future. I am looking forward to continuing the podcast and bringing another 100 great episodes of the Hour of History to you. I'm looking for much more than that. We have an enormous amount of great episodes. I sneak in repeats every once in a while because I really want you to check out these old episodes. I download them myself. Just the other day on the flight, I was listening to some of the conversations I've had over a year ago, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see how some of the topics never went out of style. We were talking about Uyghurs and China and persecution. Muslims in China, just the other day it seems. It was only a few episodes that I chatted about these issues that are still in the news. You still have time to look back and to understand, explore what's happening in our world. I'm always concerned about technology, and in the future I want to make sure that Hour of History podcast becomes the most listenable podcast one can imagine. Of course, technology often comes at a price, and I want to continue to invest in this Hour of History podcast that will continue to grow and continue to hopefully be better and better technological. It's amazing for me to listen to some of these podcasts that are produced by NPR. The technology is fantastic. The recording studio, you can tell, is professional, but there's no soul to the podcast. Often it's a formula that you can see was cooked up behind the scenes, something that was not spontaneous, not created by the will of the audience or by the eagerness of the guests, but rather created by someone in an office in a studio. My greatest fear is having a podcast that is something so dry and so bland as some of these podcasts. And I've seen some of my greatest podcasts that I listen to try to keep up with trends by changing their system. But the long-form interview works. And I'm not going to change that up on you at the Hour of History podcast. You can look forward to another 100 episodes of great guests, people with new books, graduate students without new books, non-historians who write about history, travelers, artists, philosophers, anyone who talks about history will be brought on. There aren't rules. I'm not regulated to the academy, and I'm not regulated simply towards books. I'm not tied only towards that. Rather, I'm tailored to the listener experience. I truly mean our world, anytime, any place. So with that, I want to thank you for coming on this journey, the Hour of History podcast with me. I'm currently traveling right now, and I'm still bringing you podcasts every week, and I hope you love them. I love them. It's been a great pleasure and a great joy to bring the Hour of History podcast to you. Please go back and check out some of the great conversations that have happened. Thank you so much for your retweets, your likes, your subscriptions, and your words of encouragement. History is all around us. History is embedded in every step we take, no matter what city or town you are in. No matter if you're sitting at a table listening to the Hour of History or walking on your way to work, I think this show will help you see that history is all over our world. On the Hour of History podcast, we're here for you. The guests are here for you. The audience, I hope you enjoy. The Hour of History podcast, it's our world, anytime, any place. See you next week.